Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shekalim Daf Yud contains one Mishnah which divides the daf neatly in half. The daf begins immediately after a Mishnah which discusses what you do with the Shekalim money, what you're allowed to spend that money on. The Mishnah in the middle of the daf will discuss what you do with the leftovers, various different categories of leftover money from the Shekalim, what you're allowed to spend that on. So, we had seen in the Mishnah that there was a machlokes between Rabbi Yosi and the Chachamim whether or not you're allowed to spend shekel money on a watchman who's going to watch the grain that's growing during Shemitah to be used for the Karban HaOmer. Now, the Gemara said that machlokes is based on a question: if somebody privately owns something and he donates it to be given to be used for something which is a tzibur responsibility, is that good? Can the tzibur use something which was donated by a private individual for public use? According to Rabbi Yosi, yes, even if that watchman will keep his Shemitah fruits for himself, he can later donate it to the public use, and that's alright, he could use it for the Karban HaOmer. According to the Chachamim, that would not be acceptable. We cannot allow him to do that. You kind of have a private individual donating something to be used by the public if it has to come from public funds. Now, the Gemara brings two other examples, two other Mishnayos, and the Gemara wants to say that they both seem to fit with the opinion of Rabbi Yosi. So the Gemara's first one is a Mishnah Maseches Taanis, which discusses the wood that was used for the fire, the maracha, the fire on the Mizbeach. And the Gemara over there had said, the Mishnah over there had said that there were 9 families that donated wood to be used in the fire on the Mizbeach immediately when they returned from the Golus, and they built the second Beis HaMikdash. They didn't have enough wood for the fire. 9 families stepped forward and offered those woods. And the Nevi'im at the time promised them that as a reward for that, any time in the future when they want to donate wood for the fire on the Mizbeach, even if there's a whole storehouse full of wood, they'll take their wood first and use it first. So this mission seems to indicate clearly that we can accept woods, which is supposed to be public, we can accept it from a private individual from these 9 families and use it for public karbanos. That's the machlokes Rishonim here, if the wood is considered a carbon itself, and it's a public carbon, or if it's just considered something which helps the carbon. But either way, the Gemara is claiming that this would have to fit with Rabbi Yosi. Next, the Gemara brings another Mishnah, which the Gemara says also seems to fit with Rabbi Yosi only, and that is where it says that a woman is allowed to make big day. She's allowed to make big day kahuna. Let's say her son is a kohen gadol. She wants to make big day kahuna for him, so she's allowed to, as long as she gives it to the tzibur. It belongs to the tzibur first, because the big day kahuna have to come from the tzibur. They can't belong to a private individual. This also is Rabbi Yosi, because he says that a private individual can donate something for public use, and it's considered to be belonging to the public. So Gemara says, this is Rav Acha's understanding of these two Mishnayos. He says this has to be Rabbi Yosi. However, the Gemara says that there is an Amir named Rabbi Yosi, who says the name of Rav Ila, that no, both of these could actually fit with the Chachamim. What's the reason? Because neither of these are karbanos. The wood for the Mizbeach and the Big Day Kahuna are helping the carbon. There, even the Chachamim agree that's allowed to come from a private individual who donates it to the public. The only machlokes was about something like the Karban HaOmer. That has to come, that is a carbon itself. That is where there's a machlokes that whether or not it could come from somebody private who's donating it for public use. Now the Gemara says that there is a clear proof from an additional Mishnah to the opinion of Rabbi Yosi. That is the Amayra Rabbi Yosi, that there is no machlokes between the Tana Rabbi Yosi and the Chachamim in this case. Specifically, the case being discussed here is the wood, and that even the Chachamim would agree that that wood could come from private families, and that's because there's a Mishnah that has a machlokes between Rabbi Yosi and the Chachamim whether those families made a Yom Tov on those days, even when the Beis HaMikdash wasn't around. We know those families, when the Beis HaMikdash was around, they made a Yom Tov on. There were special days that were set aside by them as a Yom Tov in memory of their tremendous chesed that they did. The Mishnah there in Taanis lists those 9 special days for them. The question is, did those days continue even after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed? It wasn't around anymore. Did those families continue to celebrate it or not? And the Mishnah, there quote some machlokes between the Beis and the Chachamim whether or not they continued to celebrate it after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. And the Gemara, the Brisa there even quotes Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Tzadok, who says, I was from the family of Sana ben Binyamin, who was one of those families, and once Tisha B'Av was pushed off from Tisha B'Av to Yud Av because Tisha B'Av was Shabbos, and you know what, we didn't even finish the fast day because Yud Av is one of our special Yomim Tovim, because it's one of the days where my family gave wood. So you see that the point here is that we see that both Rabbi Yossi and Chachamim agree that there was a Yom Tov. They argue about whether or not it continued after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, but they do agree that there was a Yom Tov, which means that wood was accepted privately, and therefore that's a proof to what Rabbi Yossi said, that the machlokes between what Rabbi Yossi the Amir said, that the machlokes between Rabbi Yossi the Tana and the Chachamim does not apply about something like the woods. It only applies about the Karban Omer itself. Okay, now the Gemara moves on. The Gemara notes that there's a machlokes between Rabbi Yishmael the Tana and the Chachamim whether or not the Karban Omer can come from fruits of Chutz La'aretz. We know it has to be from barley. Does it have to be from Eretz Yisrael barley, or could it be from Chutz La'aretz barley? So the Gemara says Rabbi Yishmael holds that it has to be from Eretz Yisrael barley. It cannot be from Chutz La'aretz barley. It can't even be from Syria. Syria has some kedusha to it, but it cannot be from Syrian barley. It has to be from Eretz Yisrael barley only. So the Gemara wants to bring three Mishnayos which seem to fit with Rabbi Yishmael only. So the Gemara says our Mishnah here seems to fit with Rabbi Yishmael only. Our Mishnah said that you're allowed to hire people to guard the barley growing wild during Shemitah, so that you have barley to be able to use for the Karban Omer. That must be the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, because if it's the opinion of the Chachamim should say, why do you have to guard Shemitah barley to make sure you have some growing and people won't take it? Take from Chutz La'aretz where there's no Shemitah, no problem. Obviously, this is Rabbi Yishmael holds you can't take from Chutz La'aretz. You got to take from Eretz Yisrael, and the only Eretz Yisrael stuff is Shemitah, and it could get taken by anybody or by animals. So you have to hire guards to make sure that it don't get taken. Now, the Gemara disagrees with this. The Gemara says not necessarily true. The Gemara brings someone who argues and says it's not necessarily true. It could be that this is not really Rabbi Yishmael's opinion. And even the Chachamim would agree here. And the reason is because there may not be barley in the Chutz La'aretz. And we want you to guard the barley in Eretz Yisrael. Just in case we can't find any barley in the Chutz La'aretz, we say therefore you're allowed to set up guards to watch and make sure that we should have barley here and we shouldn't lose the opportunity to bring the carbon. Now, next Mishnah, the Gemara says only fits with the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, is a brisa that pretty clearly says what Rabbi Yishmael holds. The brisa says all karbanos yachan and tzibur have to come from Eretz Yisrael and from Chutz La'aretz, and it could come from Eretz Yisrael or Chutz La'aretz. It could come from chadash, new grain, or from yashin, old grain, except for the Karban Omer and the shtei lechem, the two breads that are brought on Shavuos. They have to be from chadash, and it has to be from Eretz Yisrael. That's clearly Rabbi Yishmael's opinion. The Gemara brings another brisa. The brisa says that there are 10 levels of kedusha. Eretz Yisrael is one level of kedusha, and kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is such that you can bring the Karban Omer from it, you can bring bikurim from it, and you can bring shtei lechem from it, and you cannot bring it from any other lands. Again, clearly the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael that says that you can only bring the Karban Omer from Eretz Yisrael. Now the Gemara brings another brisa. This is a statement of Rabbi Yishmael explicitly, and the Gemara says that this coincides with his opinion here. Now, the Rishonim struggle to see what the two have in common, but let's just say it out. The Gemara quotes Rabbi Yishmael, who says, what do you do with the pasuk that says B'charisha v'katzir tishbois? It says in Shabbos you're not allowed to do charisha, you're not allowed to plow, and you're not allowed to do katzir, you're not allowed to cut, you're not allowed to reap grain. So Gemara says it's as follows: there is a link between harvesting and plowing. Just like plowing is always an optional activity, there is never a mitzvah to plow. There does not exist any mitzvah to plow. So the isser of plowing on Shabbos is always only referring to optional plowing, never to mitzvah plowing. Therefore, so the link to harvesting is that the isser on Shabbos to harvest also only refers to optional harvesting. There is a type of harvesting which is a mitzvah, and that you're allowed to do on Shabbos. What is that? That is harvesting the omer, the barley for the Karban Omer. Sometimes the day of harvesting will fall out on Shabbos. This is according to the opinion that you have to actually harvest the grain on the 16th of Nisan, which is the day you bring the Karban Omer. You can't harvest it earlier, and if you do harvest it earlier, it's possible to be used for the Karban Omer. And if that day falls on Shabbos, you're allowed to harvest. It pushes, because it's a mitzvah, it pushes away the isser of harvesting on Shabbos. This is what Rabbi Yishmael says. The Gemara says this fits very nicely with our Rabbi Yishmael, who says you're allowed to hire guards in order to protect the grain on Shemitah. And the Rishonim simplest understanding is that the Shemitah and Shabbos are very similar things, and if Rabbi Yishmael holds that you're allowed to push away the halacha of not harvesting on Shabbos in order to bring the Karban Omer, he would also say you're allowed to push away the halacha of not guarding grain during Shemitah, and a number of other halachas of Shemitah which you're also allowed to forego in order to be able to harvest the grain and have grain to be able to keep for the Karban Omer. Now the Gemara says, what is the halacha about actually planting? Can you plant grain in order to be able to use for the Karban Omer? Can you plant it on Shemitah? Most Rishonim understand why asking Shemitah. Can you plant it on Shemitah? It's forbidden to plant anything on Shemitah. Do we push away Shemitah and say not only allowed to harvest, but you're also allowed to plant? So the Gemara says Rabbi Chia bar Abba asked a question in front of Rabbi Mana, and he said, what would be the point? It would be forbidden to use anything which you planted on Shemitah. So what would be the point in planting it? Why would be the point in allowing you to plant it? You wouldn't be able to use it. Anything which is harvested or planted on Shemitah is aser. It would be like somebody who takes a kaimetz from a carbon mincha where the carbon mincha is aser. The halacha is that every carbon mincha has something similar to the shechita of a carbon animal. The shechita is what allows the animal to be used. The kaimetz is a handful that's taken off that allows the mincha to be used. Now, putting that handful on the mizbeach is part of the avodah of the carbon mincha, and when it goes in the mizbeach, that's when the rest of the mincha is allowed to be eaten. So the halach is you can't put it on the mizbeach if the rest of the carbon is disqualified anyway. If there's something wrong with the carbon, like it's tummy or something, so you have no reason to put the kaimis on the mizbeach because it's not matir or anything. So here also, what would be the point in planting during Shemitah if you wouldn't be allowed to harvest it, you wouldn't be allowed to use it? Someone says that's not necessarily a good comparison. There are 5 types of karbanos, which even though they're tummy and they can't be used, you're still allowed to do the avodah of it, even though you won't be able to use the carbon itself. The 5 are listed in Maseches Pesachim, and this could be like one of those as well. Okay, now the Gemara goes on to another subject. We said you're allowed to use the shkalim to pay salaries. How do you do that? You can't take shkalim which have kedusha and give it to a person, a regular person, as a payment. That is taking kedusha money and giving it to somebody to use. How does it become chulin? The halacha is that kedusha things never become chulin unless you transfer the kedusha onto something. So the Gemara says, here's what we do. The guy does his work, we pay him right away with money that we borrow. The Beis Hamikdash borrows money from a money changer in order to be able to pay him on that day exactly. We don't have money to pay him at this time. Later, when we actually take the money, we actually take the grain that he watched, and we harvest it, and we sift it, and we sift it again 10 times until we have such pure flour that we can use it for the carbon aimer. Now, we take money from the shkalim, and we buy the carbon aimer flour with it, meaning we transfer the kedusha from the carbon aimer, we transfer the kedusha from the shkalim money onto the carbon aimer. And that takes the kedusha off the money. We take this money and we pay back the money that we borrowed. So Gemara asks, what do you mean? It's going to be much less money than you borrowed. Hooray, you bought grain and you bought much more than you ended up with because you sifted it 10 times. You end up with 1/10 the size of the grain that you started with. It's going to be much less money. So Gemara says, no, we make a condition with the person in the beginning that the amount of money we're going to pay him is going to be equal to the value of what's left at the end. Now the Gemara has a very similar discussion about stones which are used for construction projects in the Beis Hamikdash. The Gemara says, how do you pay the worker who cuts and shapes and smooths the stones? The Gemara says, again, you borrow money to pay him, and when the stones are finished, you transfer the kedusha from the shkalim money onto the stones, and then the money goes to chulin, and you pay the loan. So Gemara says again, that's far less money than the stones are worth, because you have to chop away, and a lot of the stones get ruined and cracked and disqualified, and they're worth much less. Gemara says, no, we make the condition in the beginning that this is the amount of money he's going to get paid, and that's the amount of money he's working for, and he's aware of that. But now we get the next Mishnah, which discusses what happened with money that was left over after the main uses of the Machatzis Shekel were spent. So there's a couple of different categories of leftovers. First of all, the money that was withdrawn from the main collections. It was put in boxes that were separate, that the money for buying karbanos was drawn from. When all the karbanos were spent, there was money left there. There's also money that was left in the original collection boxes. And then there is money in each of these after the extra expenses were spent from them. There's still more money left. What did they spend that for? So the Gemara first discusses what they do with more money that was left in the collection box. This is not leftovers. This is other things which came from the withdrawal box. This is the small box that they took out of the big box. Besides for karbanos that we mentioned in the previous Mishnah, the Gemara also says that they took money to buy paraduma, money to buy the special goat that was pushed off a cliff, the Soyer HaMishtaleach L'Azazel on Yom Kippur, and they also used it to buy the red strip of wool which went into the burning of the paraduma. These things all came from the money that was taken out, and it was in the special box of withdrawal. Now, the red strip should not be confused with other red strips, which the Gemara will discuss later. Okay, now the Gemara says what happened with the money that was left in the big collection box in the Beis Hamikdash. Because after they withdrew, there was shirayim, there was leftovers. What to do with that money? So the Gemara says, well, when they brought the paraduma, they had to build a special bridge so that any tumma underneath would be blocked and not reach the paraduma. Building that bridge was built with money that was left over in the collection box originally. It was also a special ramp built for the Sar Mishtalech, the goat and Yom Kippur that went. That ramp wasn't because of Tumah. That ramp was because people would be trying to push the goat out. They said, get rid of this guy in his Averis, and they would pull at him and drag at the hair of the goat in their anxiety to get rid of their Averis. So they made a special ramp for him to walk so people shouldn't be able to reach them. Now, there was also a strip of wool that was tied between the horns of the Sar Mishtalech. That was not a carbon. These were all not karbanis. These ramps, these are all not karbanis, and therefore they couldn't be spent from the money that was withdrawn from the shkalim box, but it could be used for the leftovers, right? The original shkalim can only be used for actual karbanis tzibra, like the Sarah Mishtalech and the Paraduma. Those things were real karbanis tzibra. Okay, so we're in the middle of the list of things that were used in the rest of the money that was left in the collection box. And where it says also it was used to maintain the stream of water that ran through the Azar, which was used to wash the Azar. It was also used to maintain the walls of the city and the towers of the city and any other needs for the city of Yerushalayim. It all came from the leftover that was in a big collection box for the Machzis HaShekel. Okay, now the Gemara brings a machlokes about the ramp of the paraduma. The Gemara says Abba Shol disagrees. He says the ramp for bringing the paraduma to stop the tama, that the Kahanim Gedolim built out of their own money. They very much wanted to see that was a tahar, and therefore they did that themselves. Okay, now the Mishnah goes on to the leftovers in the big collection box after these main expenses. Let's say there was still more money left after these expenses were all done. What did they do with that? So Gemara brings a machlokes about this. Gemara brings Tanakama. The Gemara says it's Rabbi Shmuel, who says that they used it to buy special wine, oil, and flour that would be kept in special kedusha chambers in the Beis HaMikdash, and they sold that to people who needed to buy wine, oil, and flour, but tahara to use for their kabban mincha. And Rabbi Kiva said, no, you're not allowed to do business with the money, with the belongings of hektish. You're not allowed to do business with the belongings of the poor. You shouldn't do business with the belongings of the poor because they may need the money. You have to keep it in liquid form. You shouldn't do business with hektish because it looks like hektish doesn't have enough income and they need to scrounge around to do business to make money, and that doesn't look good. That's not the right approach for the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore they couldn't use it. Now, Rabbi Kiva doesn't say what was done with the extra money, and Rabbi Shmuel doesn't say what happened with the money that you earned from selling those supplies. Okay, we'll see later. The Gemara will discuss it, and the Mishnah might hint to it later as well. All right, now the Gemara goes back to the leftovers of the withdrawal box. After we did the main expenditures out of the main withdrawal box, the small withdrawal box, there's money left there. What do you do with that? So the Gemara brings a couple of opinions. The Gemara says one opinion, Tanakama, is that they used it to buy thin sheets of gold that they used to cover the walls and the floor of the Kodesh Kodashim. Rabbi Shmuel says no, they used it to buy karbanis for when the mizbeach was empty, and Rabbi Shmuel says they used it to buy klei shares. Those are the tools used for the mizbeachos. Then he says something called moiser haperos, extra fruits, that was used for when the mizbeach was empty. The Gemara will discuss what these extra fruits are. What is this money? What is he referring to? Now, the next two opinions specifically disagree with that extra fruits. They do not hold to use the extra fruits for that. But Rabbi Kiva says the extra money in the withdrawal box was used for when the mizbeach was empty, and there was other money that was used for kli shares. That is money that was left over from buying the sachim, buying the wine and the flour that went on the mizbeach. Rabbi Chanani Eskana Kahanim says no, the extra money from the sachim that went for when the mizbeach was empty, and the extra money in the withdrawal box that was used for buying kli shares. And like we said earlier, they both disagree with Rabbi Shmuel about the fruits. The money left over from the fruits, they don't hold to that. Okay, the Gemara will discuss that. Okay, now the Gemara says about the strips of wool. So we discussed the red strip of wool. We know that there are two strips that were mentioned in the Mishnah. There's a third. The three strips of wool that could exist in different types of avodas were as follows. There was a strip of wool that was thrown into the fire that burned the paraduma. There's a strip of wool that was tied onto the head, the center between the horns of the Sarah Mishtalech Azazel, the goat that went over the cliff by Azazel. And there was another strip of red wool that was used for the process of being Matahar Mitzayra. So it says that they had to have different weights. And the Gemara says as follows: the one for the Sarah Mishtaleach had to be big enough to tear into two strips. One was tied in the Azara and the Beis Hamikdash itself, and one was tied onto the goat itself. In order to be big enough to tie into two strips, it had to be at least a weight of a selah. That's a shekel of the midbar. Now the one that went for Taras Mitzayra, that was enough to be a shekel, that's half of a selah. And the one that had to be thrown into fire of the paradum had to be heavy. So Machlokes here how heavy it had to be. According to the first opinion, it had to be 2 slime. According to the second opinion, it had to be 2.5 slime. And another way of saying 2.5 slime is it had to be the size of 10 zuz. That's the same size as 2.5 slime. So either way, it had to be heavy. Now, why did it have to be so heavy? It had to be heavy because the halacha was that it had to fall into the bottom of the fire. It couldn't get flown around by the flames. It had to fall deep into the fire because it says, you have to throw it into the burning of the fire, and therefore it has to fall deep and it had to be heavy. Okay, the Gemara discusses other things which were brought with the money that was left over in the big collection box. Other expenditures for that, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shmuel says that the Talmid Chachamim who taught the Kahanim how to do the avoda, they taught them Shchita, how to slaughter the animals, Kabbalah, how to catch the blood, how to throw the blood on the Mizbeach. Those Talmid Chachamim got paid with money left over in the box. The Gemara says further, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Radifa says the name of Rabbi Avimi. People used to check carbonates for a mum, got paid from that box. Ravacha named Rabbi Tamchar Bechia and says in the name of Rabbi Simlai, people would fix the Sefer Torah and the Azara. They got paid from that box. And Gidel bar Binyamin says in the name of Asi that there were special judges who sat and they judged cases of theft and other types of specific cases, knasos, fines. They got paid from that box as well. Now the Gemara brings a machlokes about one other thing. The Gemara says women who used to weave the paroiches, according to Shmuel, they got paid from that box because Shmuel holds that is considered to be karbonis. Why is the paroiches karbonis? Because the chatas, which is brought inside the Beis Hamikdash, had his blood sprinkled on that paroiches, so it's part of karbonis. According to another opinion of Chuna, though that wasn't karbonis, and therefore those women got paid from special donations that were given to the Beis Hamikdash for the general upkeep. So this pareches was part of the general upkeep, was part of the building of the Beis Hamikdash itself, and therefore they got paid from that box. The Gemara now brings a brisa which discusses the sources of funding for other things. The Gemara quotes a brisa of Rabbi Yehuda bar Gregores, who says that Ketairis and any kabra and tzibur came from the money that was in the truma, the withdrawal box. The Mizbeach Hazav, the golden Mizbeach which was inside the Heichol, and any other Kli Sharis. Now the Mizbeach Hazav was considered Kli Sharis because it was movable, it was not fixed to the ground. So any other Kli Sharis, they all come from the leftover funds that were from the Nesachim, as we discussed earlier. The regular Mizbeach and the funding for the upkeep of the Heichol, which is the structure of the Beis Hamikdash itself, and the Azaris, the Ezras Nashim, Ezras Yisrael, they all come from the special box which was for the funding for the upkeep of the Beis Hamikdash, the Bedek Habayis. Now, anything which is outside the Azara, like the walls of Yerushalayim or the towers, that came from the leftovers of the big collection box for the Machzis HaShekel, like we discussed earlier in the mission. Now, where's the kasha on this? How could you say that the funding for the rest of the walls and the stones of Yerushalayim came from the leftovers of the Machzis HaShekel? That can be because we know that the halacha is, we have a brisa that says that anybody who uses the stones for the walls of Yerushalayim is violating the Isser Me'ilah. He's using something which is hektish for his own purposes. Now, the leftover money in that box didn't have Kedusha. There was no Isser Me'ilah on that. So Gemara wants to answer. The Gemara says, no, well, there's an opinion of Rabbi Meir that says that there is Me'ilah on that. There is Kedusha on that. Even the leftovers in the box after those withdrawals still has Kedusha, as we saw a few daf ago. The Gemara says, no. Rabbi Meir only says that because you could end up using it for karbanos. He doesn't say that it has Kedusha forever. He just says for the duration of this year, as long as it's this year's crop of Machzis HaShekel, it has Kedusha. And that's not going to apply to the stones that are going to stay in the wall of the Yerushalayim forever, and therefore it doesn't fit. We have a kasha like that. And the Gemara leaves it as that. Now the Gemara brings another brisa of Rabbi Yehuda bar Greigaros as to which kalim, which objects in the Beis Hamikdash have to be there in order to be able to bring karbanis. So the Brisa says as follows: you have to have the shulchan and menorah in both mizbechos. You have to have the paroiches that covers the Kadesh HaKadashim. You have to have all those things there in order to be able to bring a karbanis. That's according to Rabbi Meir. The Chachamim say the only thing you have to have is the mizbeach, the main outer mizbeach with its horns, and a special design which is on the upper part. Now that's called a karkov. That could be the design, or it could be the seivev, the outer ledge that the Kohanim used to walk around about midway up the mizbeach itself. So we have this machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim what you have to have there. But, says the Gemara, none of them fit with a bunch of statements of Amoraim. And this is a brisa, and Amoraim can't argue with it. So what do the Amoraim say? So Gemara, the Amoraim say what you have to have in order to bring karbanos depends on the words that the Torah uses to say where you should set them up. Sometimes the Torah says you should put it noichach, which means a cross, opposite. Sometimes it says you should put it tzela, which sounds like on the side, like a rib. Sometimes it says sima. So which ones are which items do you have to have in place in order to bring a karbanis? So Rabbi Yosef ben Chanina and Rabbi Eliezer say only things that it says noichach. What does it say noichach about? About the menorah. So that doesn't fit, that's the only thing. So that doesn't fit with either of those two opinions. Nobody said just the menorah. Gemara brings the next opinion, which is Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman name of Yonason, that says anything which says neichach or tzela. So that's the menorah and the shulchan. They say it says neichach about the menorah, it says tzela about the shulchan, and you have to have those. Now that also doesn't fit with any of the two opinions. The last one is Rav Ila, in the name of Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, says anything where it says is sima, and that it says about most of the things in the Beis Hamikdash. It says vayasam es sevener, vayasam es parchas and malchas ha masach, vayasam es mizbach hazah, vayasam es akiyar, vayitin es hashulchan, v'samtim es hashulchan. It says it about almost everything. So that doesn't fit. None of these fit. So Gemara says there's talking about two different types of avodah here. The Brisa was talking about karbanos that go on the mizbeach outside the outer mizbeach. They're talking about the avodah inside the building of the Beis Hamikdash, such as the lechem hapanim and ketores and the menorah, all those, and the chatas that are inside. All those things have to have these special things, and that's what these three machlokes Amoraim is about. But none of them are discussing the same topic as the
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.